and you know, the South uniformly prohibits public sector bargaining. Public sector, they can't prevent union formation, but they uniformly make unlawful collective bargaining by public employees. And you know, some northern states do that, but it's not as pronounced. So the whole idea was to first of all educate a European audience. This was the audience we had in mind: European trade unionists, European company officials, European government officials, and European Union officials, but to explain, you know, why this situation in the South is different. And you know, this is nothing new. It's been going on for the last 25 or 30 years or even more. European companies investing in the South, and yes, they create factories and they create a certain number of jobs. And you would think that after 25 or 30 years, there would be some reflection of gain and growth and benefit for the people of the South because of all this investment by European companies. But no, we still see, after these many decades of European investment and so on, that the states of the South are still largely at the bottom of every measure of social well-being in terms of poverty and income and health standards, infant mortality, education, teacher pay, you know, the lowest, as I said, the lowest workers' comp, the lowest unemployment insurance, and so on. So, you know, what is going on here? And in part, what is going on is that the southern state governments give so many hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to the companies that set up there, that they're basically robbing the people of their states, you know, and they're defunding their own tax base that could otherwise provide for better teacher pay and better conditions and so on. So that's why we think the South is a special case that does merit some special attention and analysis, and that's what we wanted to convey to our colleagues in the European labor movement. The first part of the report goes through a very large framing exercise. You know, we talk about, and we were guided in this by our interlocutors in Europe. You know, when we sent them early drafts, you know, they came back and said, wait a minute, what is this about Reconstruction? You know, they didn't know that there was a period after the Civil War when there was actually a flowering of democracy and participation and you know, and African American political power and so on. You know, they didn't know that, and they also asked, "What is this Jim Crow? We hear this Jim Crow, but you know, we don't really understand it." So we had to kind of walk through the history and the legacy of slavery and the history and legacy of Jim Crow. And you know, bring home what that means, and of course we, you know, tied it to the history of workers and unions in the South, and this whole idea that, you know, and it's still a theme that is widely circulated among employers in the South, that unions are somehow Yankee forces, alien forces coming down from the North. You know, they still say that, you know, if the steelworkers, even though the steelworkers have been in Alabama for decades and it's, you know, they're doing a great job, they still talk about, oh, this is a Pittsburgh union. You know, if it's, you know, Airbus in Alabama, they talk about the machinist union as, oh, this is a union in Washington State up in the North. It's an example of why the South is a special case. You know, in the North, we don't say, unions are an alien force coming down from Canada. But in the South, it's still very common to say unions are an alien force coming down from New York and Pennsylvania and Washington State and so on. This idea of unions as an alien force, and it's always been tied directly to the question of racism and you know, unions deceiving African American workers and so on with their you know, lies about equality and so on and so forth. We also spend a lot of time talking about right to work. There's a lot of misunderstanding about right to work. Even in the United States, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. But it is this concept. It's been so deeply driven into the psyche of workers in the South. I used to see it when I was a union organizer for the UE in Virginia and North Carolina. I do house visits, right, which is the basic work of union organizing. And people would say to me, well, we're a right to work state, so they can just fire me. And, I'd have to walk people through, well, there is a risk of getting fired, but it has nothing to do with being a right to work state. But the idea that right to work equals, we can't we can't have a union because we're a right to work state. But upon examination, the whole right to work movement and philosophy was absolutely part and parcel of racism. And you go back into the early origins of the right to work movement, and it's got a 100% racist foundation. So and we talk about that. Now, the real heart of the report, I think, is the case studies. This is where these kind of theoretical and historical and frame setting issues come to the fore. And so we put a lot of effort into getting really specific, concrete information. And I'll run through the case studies. I'll pass quickly over Skanska and LSG Skychef because the panelists who will follow will discuss those cases. But let me just say like a sentence on each, okay? So you get an idea of where the report goes with the case studies. We first look at Airbus in Mobile, Alabama. And Airbus, as you know, it's a European company based in 4 major European countries, 100% union represented, union organized, unions and works councils and the whole 9 yards, as we say, and dealing forthrightly with the unions. And in fact, the ETUC team that we're working with, they just produced a preliminary report on Airbus, which shows that Airbus actually behaves pretty well in Europe with respect to unions. But in Alabama, it's the complete anti-union, union busters, anti-union consultants, the whole kind of program that we're all too familiar with here in the United States. It's a real case of a very sharpened hypocrisy between what the company does in Europe and what the company does in Alabama. Next, we look at Fresenius. And to be honest, I didn't know what Fresenius was. I hadn't heard of Fresenius before, but it's the second biggest kidney dialysis company operating in the United States. And it's a huge multinational company in the health field, not just kidney dialysis, but lots of health fields. We went to Alabama and talked to workers there who were organizing in Fresenius. And the company, again, they brought in the anti-union consultants. And this is another one where the ETUC has looked closely at Fresenius. And there's some indication, and this is alarming, but it also shows the importance of this joint project. There's some indication that Fresenius is re-importing to Europe the kind of anti-union actions that they're taking in the United States. And we're going to have to look at that very closely. IKEA is another example. Everybody is familiar with those big IKEA stores that you pass by on the interstate. And at home, mostly in Northern Europe, IKEA deals straight up with the unions. But in the United States, and we looked particularly at an IKEA store in Florida where the company took harsh anti-union actions. And it's another example of the hypocrisy, the double standard, which is the title of the report. Brooks will talk about the LSG Skychef's case, so I won't stop there. I will mention Nestle. The next case study was Nestle, obviously a very prominent brand name, huge multinational company. We looked at their distribution center in McDonough, Georgia, where the workers launched an organizing campaign. The company brought in the anti-union consultants. They, did a whole, the usual anti-union campaign. The workers prevailed in an NLRB election. It was a case of them sticking together, and it's really a quite inspiring story. This is another case where we've learned from our colleagues in Europe that Nestle back home is starting to apply some of the anti-union strategies that they use here. You may know in the United States, Nestle unions in the United States deal with Nestle on a corporate basis. Nestle Water is a division of Nestle, Nestle Water USA, and Nestle insists that Nestle Water USA is not Nestle. We're not going to bind Nestle Water to what we might agree with you in terms of a framework agreement or some other instrument. And it turns out that only in the last few months or maybe a year, Nestle, a Nestle subsidiary in Switzerland, like 20 miles from Nestle headquarters, Nestle is saying the same thing. Oh, they're not Nestle. So they can't participate and have union participation with Nestle like the rest of us. So that's the the incipient and maybe not so incipient, but a growing problem that we're seeing in connection with this. There's a auto parts plant called Schnellica Logistics in Vance, Alabama, that demonstrated. I want to rush because well, not rush, but wrap it up quickly so that we can move on to the discussion and questions. But that was another case of a German-based company that maintains good relations at home and comes to the United States and adopts American-style Southern management, American-style anti-unionism. Skanska was a major case study. Ryan is going to talk about that. I'll just say, again, it's Skanska. In the North and in the West, Skanska generally has good relations with the unions, but in the South, they've got like this split personality, and we're learning more about it as we go along. The next case study involved what was ThyssenKrupp, the German steel manufacturer. They sold their operation there to Outokumpu. And they also gifted their unfair labor practice case to Outokumpu, and that Finnish company didn't. They just maintained the anti-union attitude. Volkswagen is the final case study. I don't think there's any need to this audience to say too much about Volkswagen, other than the fact that throughout this process in Tennessee, Volkswagen really showed itself. I mean, multiple hypocrisy. Let alone to start with, they operate non-union in Tennessee compared with everywhere else in the world. But also, they refused to accept the results of an NLRB election when a skilled trades unit voted in favor of a union. They invited in the governor of the state to give an anti-union talk shortly before the second election. They invoked the whole power structure of Tennessee. And we see that throughout the South, where politicians and not only state politicians, but federal, members of Congress and senators as well get in the middle of this, and they drive home the point that the only reason you have a job is because this company chose to come here because it's a right to work and they don't have to deal with unions and so on. And this is the kind of thing that workers confront. We ended the report with several recommendations, calling on the companies to live up to their proclaimed promises about respect for human rights and workers' rights and so on. We called upon the state governments in the South to change their own policies. Good luck with that. But we want to put together a program that can make sense to people. We also addressed European governments and the European Commission and European investors, trying to get the European conjuncture of forces to weigh in on this and to begin to put at least some pressure on companies to live up to their overall policies in the American South as well. And then we end with a call for a program, and that's what we're implementing now, a program of collaboration and cooperation between the labor movement in the United States and the labor movement in Europe to try to attack these problems and overcome these problems, not just in the American South, but also in Europe, where more and more the same types of problems are starting to emerge. Okay, I'll hold it there.
In introducing Ryan Kikaris from the Painters to talk next about Skanska, I would just point out that from the beginning, when we talked about this in our team at the AFL and talking to the affiliates quickly thereafter, we said, we don't want this to be just another bad news report. We really would like to be able to hold up a case where there was organizing and then bargaining and someplace in the South where there's been a positive experience. And I think at first we thought Skanska might have been that because of what we know about the North. Unfortunately, as you'll hear, it didn't prove to be the case, and we didn't end up having a positive case in our report, as we really did want to be able to point to one. So Ryan, if you'd go ahead and talk to us about both what was in the report with Skanska and what's going on since. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Lance. So I'll give a little bit of background on Skanska real quick before I get into the report. So Skanska, as kind of was said before, they're a large multinational builder and developer. They're headquartered in Stockholm. They pride themselves on following almost kind of like the foreign or the domestic policy of Sweden. They kind of market themselves as being a quality, high standard development company in the U.S. that are different from like a typical U.S.-based contractor. They work all over the world, particularly in Europe and here in the U.S. Increasingly, though, the U.S. market is becoming a larger share of their business. I think it's something like 40% now of their global revenue comes from the U.S. Kind of with that increased presence in the U.S., they are increasingly, particularly in the U.S. South, operating with a U.S. model, what we would call almost like a low road construction model. Their work in major cities like New York City or Seattle or Boston is still largely seen as kind of friendly, like largely union, high road development. But their southern division in particular, which is headquartered near Nashville, they've adopted all of the worst practices of the industry, but they still market themselves and play off that Skanska branding as being this, high road, different U.S. developer, sophisticated. So the U.S., IUPAT in the U.S., particularly in the U.S. South, has been a focus for us for several years now. We have what we call our strategic cities, which are kind of unique campaigns that are spearheaded by our international union, focused mainly on building capacity where we have little or no union presence. Because of, I think, the nature of IUPAT's trades that we represent, they typically have a lower barrier of entry. They're not licensed or mechanical trades. They're stereotyped as being easier to get into. So our work tends to be more difficult to organize than, say, an electrician or a plumber. So we focus kind of going on offense a little bit and trying to organize largely in the South, where we have almost no presence at all. Our cities that we focused on are Denver, Colorado, Nashville, Tennessee, Houston, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia. We call these our strategic cities. Also, because of the nature of U.S. construction, particularly in the South, we realized very quickly that this work would be primarily organizing immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. So this kind of ties into how we kind of got, how we picked Skanska as a target and how our work, how it was featured in the double standard report. So kind of how we got introduced to Skanska as a particular target in the South was they had a project in Nashville called the JW Marriott, which is, a luxury brand hotel. This is, I believe, the largest tower now in Nashville, and Skanska was the general contractor for that project. So we basically got referred to a group of workers by the laborers union who were drywall finishers who were working on that project. These workers basically had walked off the project. They had not been paid for several weeks. And because of how U.S. construction is, they don't work directly for Skanska. They worked for a subcontractor who worked for another subcontractor who then was contracted by Skanska. So there's several kind of rungs down the chain. And these workers have kind of taken, had been organizing among themselves. They connected with us, and we, started working with them, doing intakes, and ended up filing a lawsuit that attempted to enjoin Skanska with these various subcontractors to basically get them their money. I mean, they were owed, I think, collectively a little over $2 million in wages. Our immediate hope with, looking at Skanska was, oh, they're one of the good guys. They typically behave, with good standards where we, with our knowledge of them, which would primarily be up north or out west, that quickly proved not to be the case. Because of how broken U.S. labor law was, we could not enjoin Skanska in that lawsuit, so they got off the hook. We're still kind of in litigation with these two subcontractors to this day. These workers still have not gotten the money. The only money they've gotten has been from a relatively small lien we had put onto the hotel and then pressured Marriott to settle with. So this was the project that got us kind of engaged in this double standard report. And this is kind of what got us looking at Skanska as an organizing target. So it was primarily a coincidence at first. The other factor was their model. We did recognize them as this high road, socially responsible company that as far as we knew was top to bottom union in Sweden, and was mostly union in up north or out west. We thought they operated differently, and our hope was we could play on that to get some kind of easy, restitution for these workers, but that was not the case. So that was kind of like the initial phase of our campaign with Skanska here. Following that, we kind of had to see how to re-engage with them because that campaign was kind of tied up in litigation. There was not a whole lot we could do apart from continuing to pursue that path. So about a year back, Skanska started working on another very large project in Nashville. And this project is called 5th and Broadway. It's right on the main strip in Nashville. It's a large mixed development, basically a whole city block that they're redeveloping. We later last year led a delegation of local community allies in Nashville, representatives from Unite the UK, Big Nuts, which is kind of the construction federation in Sweden that represents Skanska workers, top to bottom. The current president of Big Nuts is very close with the current president of Skanska. They actually worked, kind of came through the trades working at Skanska together. So he was there. We also had people from IUPAT, Iron Workers, and various other North American trade unions. All of us are part of Building and Woodworkers International, which is kind of the IUPAT's first foray into any sort of international engagement. There have been some attempts in the past with the building trades to attempt kind of an international presence or to organize and kind of build relationships internationally. But for a long time, I mean, the stereotype among the trades was that our work, can't be outsourced. So, we almost have no need to look overseas for alliances or to, practice any kind of solidarity or anything. That's quickly becoming, apparent that it's not the case. A lot of development in general contractors are increasingly becoming international. They're getting bought up, sold, bought by different conglomerates overseas. So this is kind of our first foray into that. We initially kind of got introduced to this by, basically almost like a cold call from the Swedish Painters Union, who are one of the only other independent painters unions in the world. And they kind of introduced us to BWI. And when we started working with them and affiliated with them a little over a year ago, about 18 months ago. So we brought a delegation from BWI to Nashville. Our hope was that BWI's current framework agreement with Skanska gives us kind of the right to inspect Skanska projects anywhere. So our hope was to kind of show up, tap that agreement and say, we as BWI want to enter this job site, we want to inspect this project, and we want to talk to workers, etc. We were quickly denied entry at the gate after checking in with kind of the security guard. Skanska then proceeded to gate and deadbolt every entrance and exit on the project, which effectively locked workers in and locked us out from even entering the project. This was pretty shocking, a very surprising overreaction to a delegation that, we weren't trying to sneak on the project or, made no kind of threatening or any sort of unusual presence there. We were just trying to check in and walk onto the project. It was particularly interesting because we actually have IUPAT has signatory contractors on that project. Our workers were on that project. We had the right to enter anyway. But we've kind of found this pattern in the South of Skanska overreacting to almost any sort of provocation or organizing attempt on their projects. So we got all this on video. We've been kind of pushing that out to media companies and using it kind of to shame Skanska. We send it to their kind of worker council in Sweden. Very, very shocking stuff. Following that, we had kind of planned an escalation with Skanska to where we were going to have a day of action in kind of like late February or early March, and then we were going to actually take a trip over to Stockholm to meet with Skanska's leadership and to meet with their shareholders to kind of continue this kind of escalation. Our hope was through BWI to renegotiate their framework agreement with a North American addendum. We were kind of using the building trades model of responsible contracting as some sort of addendum to this agreement, which would kind of tweak it to kind of apply to the unique terribleness of American labor law. Unfortunately, I think the week of or the week prior to that day of action, the pandemic really took off. We had to basically make a last minute call to postpone all of this because of COVID. We kind of put a halt to our campaign entirely. It took us a bit to kind of figure out, what do we do now? I don't think many of us have too much experience on how to organize during a pandemic. We kind of quickly found out that, health and safety was the way we had to go. We were still engaged with workers in Nashville on some of these Skanska projects. We found out quickly, and there's been a lot of, news reporting around COVID outbreaks on construction projects in Nashville, including on that 5th and Broadway project. We've, seen reporting, and when we've talked to some of our members too, who have reported that there's been workers who have been sick on that project. There hasn't been really any communication from Skanska to the workers, despite Skanska marketing themselves as being one of the only general contractors and developers that has like a published plan on how to deal with COVID and like kind of their policies. Our impressions have been that they have not been following that plan at all, or if they have, it's kind of a letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law interpretation of that plan. We use some of that reporting as well as Skanska. They have this project in Florida called the I-4 Ultimate. This is a joint venture between Skanska and two other contractors called SGL, which is Skanska Granite Lane. This is a huge kind of infrastructure project, a redevelopment of the I-4 highway into a toll road. There have been, hundreds of injuries on that project, as well as I think 6 deaths as of now. This is almost unheard of in 2019, 2020. These, shocking accounts of workers getting killed in almost like just negligent ways has been just, extremely, disappointing. It's a largely non-union project. We've been engaging through BWI. While the Painters Union doesn't have any workers on that project directly, it's not really kind of in our trade's wheelhouse. We've been using that as just yet another example of kind of this, double standard of Skanska's model in the U.S. Their behavior down south versus up north is almost unheard of. Particularly in the north and out west, they're winning awards for their safety, processes, for how safe their job sites are, while at the same time you have almost like just a genuinely shocking job site down south where people are dying every few months, and then there's been hundreds of injuries. So most recently, we've been working closely with BWI, Unite, and Big Nuts over in Sweden on kind of crafting this North American addendum. We're trying to tweak this addendum a little bit to kind of, like I said, apply to U.S. law. It's been a challenge kind of explaining and breaking down how construction is different in the U.S. as opposed to in Europe in particular. But we've been working very well with our international partners, and the Painters Union is excited that, we kind of have a whole new facet to our organizing. Yeah, so that's all, Brian and Lance. That's all I got.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So Brooks, if you could give us your thoughts after listening to Lance and Ryan on the case that Unite Here was involved in.
Yeah, let me, hi, and thanks everyone for joining. I'd like to, try to leave as much time as possible for some discussion. So let me just give you the most basic background and a few facts and see where we go from there. Our case study was unusual in that it was about a fully unionized workforce. LSG Sky Chef's 10,000 airline catering workers in the US, all of them members of Unite Here. LSG Sky Chef's the largest airline catering company in the US, probably in the world. If we'd all been flying to the conference, we all would have, if not gotten food and beverages delivered onto our flights by Sky Chefs, but we would have seen the truck zipping around on the ramp and so on. Those are workers, those meals are all prepared in these massive kitchens, industrial kitchens by Sky Chefs and sometimes Gate Gourmet, and that's kind of almost it. At the time of the report, LSG was owned by Lufthansa. They've since sold the European operations, but everything else is still owned by Lufthansa. Based in Germany, of course, Lufthansa takes a very typical European stance. It says it employs staff under conditions that guarantee them social and material security. And the report documents the extent to which, in fact, it is perpetuating poverty for many Sky Chefs workers in the US while earning, record profits of billions of euros a year. The report, as Lance and everyone else understands, focused very much on the South, where the legacy of racial injustice allows Lufthansa to operate in a way that would be, I think, unacceptable in many parts of Europe. Maybe that's changing, but that's at least the thrust that we were trying to get out there. The bargaining happens under the Railway Labor Act, so challenging. I'm not going to go into that here at all, but the wages are all locally bargained. And so just a couple of specifics to give you the difference. In the outside the South, wages average about $15 an hour. In the South, wages average about $12 an hour. They start several dollars an hour lower as well. Starting pay in Charlotte, for example, $8.40 an hour. In Dallas, $9.85. Median wages in Dallas are only $11.35 an hour, despite the fact that American Airlines, which we're very focused on, is Sky Chef's biggest customer by far. Dallas, of course, is where American Airlines is headquartered and just spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a new campus. Turnover is high. It doesn't really matter in terms of workers how long they end up working. At Sky Chefs, there are a remarkable number of workers who have decades on the job who still earn, poverty wages. At Dallas, for example, at DFW, out of the 1,000 workers who work in the Sky Chef's kitchen, 140 of them have worked there for over 20 years. Their wages still average well under $15 an hour after 20 years. There's lots of workers who have worked here for 30 years who still own $13. There's issues as well about health insurance and the ridiculously low number of people who can actually afford to buy health insurance. In Miami, 15% of the workers buy health insurance for themselves. Wages are so low. Only 2% can buy coverage for their kids. So the problem is pretty self-evident. In cities in the North and elsewhere around the country, out West, workers have been able to boost wages via wage policies, winning higher living wages, higher minimum wages for airport workers. That is usually not the case in the South, where there are preemption laws that prohibit the policies. Even in cities like Miami, which passed the living wage ordinance for airport workers, Sky Chefs responded by saying, nope, we're not going to do that, and said that they were joining a lawsuit to block the enforcement of that. So that's the situation. A few months ago, we were still in bargaining over all of this, very much focused on American Airlines as a company that had made billions in profits over the last few years and was SkyChef's biggest customer. We moved very much from the subcontractor to the direct employer, SkyChef's, to American for almost all of our campaigning. That's all changed quite dramatically for obvious reasons. We're focused now very much on ensuring that the reopening as it happens is done in as safe a way as possible for the workers. And we're focused on making sure that the bailout money, $25 billion for the airline industry, billions of dollars for billions of euros for Lufthansa in Germany, hundreds of millions for SkyChefs here, that money filters down to the workers. And we're, really trying hard, and I'd be interested in thoughts about this to figure out sort of the protests that are happening all over, at least partly fueled by anger at the inequities and the racial injustice like that outlined in the report. So I'd be interested in, thoughts and kicking that around as well. So Brian, thanks. That was a mouthful.
Thank you. I want to direct people to the chat. If you haven't noticed already, Stephen Sylvia asked a couple questions about the positive cases and possibilities. So I opened up if you want to say anything further, Stephen, and then we'll try and get to your question. Do you have anything else? Okay, I guess not.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just give me a sec. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm just curious, when you were looking at cases, did you look at Daimler Trucks, which owns Freightliner, and Thomas Built Buses, and as a positive case?
I'll answer first, and then maybe Lance can add in. In all cases, the inclusion of any case was a decision of our affiliate. So we invited participation, and we had longer lists, and they reduced them. I recall other discussions about other auto parts companies. So on that particular case, I don't know, Lance, if you had comments with UAW about that.
Yeah. I think Brian made the key point in that we left it to the affiliates to tell us what were the cases that they felt were most important and most compelling, and also which might contribute to ongoing or future organizing efforts. So that's kind of the overall context. And if this goes back a ways, but I think part of the thinking about Freightliner was that the UAW didn't want to give credit to Daimler because of what they do at the Mercedes plant.
Okay. Yeah.
In Vance, Alabama, where they've just been ruthlessly anti-union. So I think that was, part of the thinking. And I know you also asked about Siemens, and I think there was another case where an organizing drive at a Siemens facility in Maryland was busted up by an anti-union in the face of this agreement that they had, because a lot of companies, they sign agreements saying, yeah, we'll remain neutral. And their idea of neutral is, okay, we won't fire people.
Yeah.
They still bring in the consultants and have all the stuff about, if you go on strike, we can permanently replace you. And the union are a bunch of liars and thieves, and all they want is your dues money. And, oh, we're just giving people the facts. That's being neutral. Telling people the facts is part of being neutral. So I think that was part of it too. Let me say one more word about a positive case. We did have one early on that we were developing. It involved Electrolux in Tennessee, the Swedish appliance maker. And it was a good case because Electrolux moved the plant from Canada to Tennessee and broke a union organizing drive initially at a first attempt. And then the unions got involved with the Swedish unions, and the Swedish unions got Electrolux to totally change their policy. And they did remain genuinely neutral. And the union won a second election and got a good collective bargaining agreement. And we were primed to include that case in the study, and Electrolux closed the plant. And I don't think they closed it, I think it was a strictly business decision, didn't have anything to do with the union and the contract or anything like that. But it was we couldn't do anything with a case like that, even though the organizing and bargaining had gone well.
I want to add one thing before we get to a new question. Again, on Siemens, I mean, the agreement that you mentioned in the chat is interesting, and I think it still remains a potential thing. that some affiliates are more hopeful than others, but the very fact that it's necessary when there's a global framework agreement, but you need, again and again, it's shown that you need a special side agreement. And I think Ryan was mentioning something like this. What does the global framework agreement mean in the United States? Because we're not part of the globe, I guess. So this has happened in other multinational cases where also with RWDSU, with I think it's in the case of H&M, where they've got special agreements. So what does it mean in the United States? So that sort of indicates that there's a problem that is very much like the admission of American exceptionalism in the bad sense. Another question from Virginia, can any one of you talk about the role of race in organizing campaigns and or employer strategies that make organizing challenging? And just read the rest of the question. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that. I know different stories, but Ryan with the immigrant workforce in Nashville, and Brooks, I mean, the cover of the report and all the workers you're talking about, it's almost entirely African American. So either one of you want to say something?
Well, we took a group of workers over to Frankfurt several times to meet with their German counterparts in the 2,000 person kitchen, Sky Chef's kitchen at Frankfurt Airport, at Fraport. And I was kind of blown away at the extent to which the workers got it. Like both groups, they understood the issues are kind of quite similar. And we're seeing that, I guess, now, right? Through the fact that the protests are happening all over the place, not just in the US, that the extent to which racism is a thing everywhere, more than a thing, but is a gigantic issue everywhere. The European Union certainly understand that. The European workers certainly understood that when we met with them. That was true at Heathrow when we met with workers from Sky Chefs. It was true in Frankfurt. It was true in the Works Council meeting, the Sky Chefs Works Council meeting that we attended. That doesn't necessarily make it any easier to deal with because everyone understands the challenges. Often the white workers have the best jobs. In Sky Chefs, that's most often as drivers, by far the highest paid jobs. You have to be credentialed with a commercial driver's license. And the difficulties in getting promoted into those jobs or getting moved into those jobs from other positions in the kitchen and elsewhere, very, very difficult. That's an internal issue. That's an issue that the company, of course, uses quite dramatically. It was an issue that was front and center in our bargaining as well. So we'll see where we end up on that. But now I think we have much more ability because all of this is happening. I'm quite optimistic about our ability to tackle that head on.
Let me just say a word. That's a great question, Ginny. And we had to confront it. In some respects, it was because our European partners, whom we were in constant exchange with, they tended to think that, isn't the problem that all the workers are African American and all the supervisors and managers are white, and so you have the racist effect takes place because of that. And we had to explain, actually no, the workers are African American and white and Latino, and they are all, I mean, not 100%, but there are union activists and supporters among all those groups. So there's not really a sharp differentiation, racial or ethnic-based differentiation in terms of union support. And actually, many frontline supervisors are African American and Latino and white, and they're under management's thumb, so they can only do so much, whatever their personal feelings are. So we had to tease out some of those issues and explain it. But underlying everything, of course, the racial question is still front and center because of the whole legacy of racism and the intersectionality of racism and anti-unionism and so on.
If it's okay, just to add one thing, when you look at the UAW, the three cases of Volkswagen Chattanooga, Vance, Alabama, and Canton, Mississippi. In Volkswagen Chattanooga, Vance, Alabama, the workforce is predominantly white, and they really didn't push race all that much. In Canton, Mississippi, the workforce is 80% black, and they really rolled out a heavy civil rights-based campaign, worked with local ministers and civil rights organizers. They worked with French people at Renault. It was tough to get enough workers in the plant to support the union because of external, all the other pressures that the report talks about in Mississippi.
Ryan, did you want to weigh in on that? And I'd like to get to the questions of leverage that people put in the chat, but Ryan, quickly on that.
Yeah, I mean, our experiences in all of our, Southern organizing is that race colors everything, particularly in construction. I mean, you're looking at super majority of workers who are primarily, Latino men, but also increasingly women, who, particularly in our trades, and huge chunks of them are undocumented. It adds a whole nother kind of point of leverage for the employers who know this. I mean, I do not believe for 1 second that Skanska in Nashville doesn't know that the majority of the workers for their subcontractors are undocumented. They absolutely use that to pressure these workers, to make sure they're scared, and to suppress any kind of organizing at all. I mean, it came up almost immediately in Nashville when those workers walked off the job because they weren't paid, almost immediately. And it's kind of like almost like a whisper campaign a lot of times by the employer. It's rare that they'll bring it up directly, but we have heard them bring it up directly. So it's something we've had to deal with. I feel like that our international partners kind of know that there's racism in the U.S., but they do not understand, I don't think, the complexities of U.S. law and how racism plays into suppressing organizing, and down to the very business models that Skanska in particular is pushing in the U.S. South.
So I would just add that, again, to connect it with the protests now and mobilizations, you're seeing those also in Europe, in France, in the UK, and elsewhere. So I think that this is certainly being picked up on some way. About the leverage, we're running out of time, but I would just say this is part of the reason that we wanted to do the report and share the report. Frankly, I think the works councils haven't been that effective on this. It's not the same as union representation, who participates in the works councils, but that's still a place that we've tried to intersect. And I would say that some of the unions definitely have engaged and have been helpful. I know that in the case of LSG, they did get, the European unions did get you into a room that you wouldn't have been in without their help to get some meetings. So we're moving on this, but it hasn't been easy. I think in principle, everybody recognizes the problem. Now it's a matter of moving it on to action. I don't know if one other thing I'll mention with that is things like socially responsible investors have been part of what we're doing about leverage, but that can't work alone. It's only one piece. Lance, did you want to say any more about the leverage questions from Wilma and Dale?
This is the problem, what is to be done is always the problem. And you can only get so far with naming and shaming. And, to some extent, the report is naming and shaming. But we hope that the work around it and the ongoing work with Europeans can lead to, some more concrete support and concrete collaboration and action that will actually, through negotiating renewed framework agreements, or even directly in collective bargaining. The observation that the European unions might have some tendency to not want to go after their company in an American union corporate campaign style is absolutely correct. In general, they have strong relationships, and they don't want to jeopardize those relationships by, sort of going out on a limb for their American comrades. And that's understandable. I mean, that's the kind of problem and dynamic that Brian and the international department at the AFL-CIO has to manage, and the international relations people in each of the unions. But it's definitely a factor, and we all have to learn how to work with it. I think our European comrades have actually been quite forthcoming and helpful as far as they're able to go, given that context that, they've got the kind of relationship with management that a lot of American unions would like to have.
And I would add into that, I mean, the more this problem arrives on their own shores and doorsteps, the more that we can expect them to, I think, get involved. And I was at an ETUC meeting almost a year ago where the brothers and sisters from, I think it was Romania and Poland, were very interested in this report. It wasn't out yet. It was in development. And they were asking the same questions of Western and Northern Europe. What about the rest of Europe? So they have their Southern question, to refer to the Gramsci concept, and that's a task of the European Union and the stronger member states and labor movements to move on. So I posted the report, and I don't know, we are slightly over time. Yes, the Works Council and the Siemens one. As I said, let's see if our affiliates can make that matter, that report. I mean, that agreement. I think it's a memorandum of understanding, and it's a regular consultation, but like a lot of global framework agreements itself, it doesn't have a lot of leverage in its commitments. Anyway, any final comments from anyone on the panel? I'm sorry we're rushing this, but I think we're at time.
Thanks.
No, only to thank everybody for sticking with it, and I found it to be a very fruitful session. I learned a lot. I wrote the report, and I still learn from discussions like this. So much appreciated.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you all.